Jerusalem stone. A man in mirrored sunglasses standing by his car called out to them at Jerusalem's Lion's Gate. "Excuse me, ladies, you like a tour, Mount of Olives?" "How much?" Carly said. 200. Very reasonable. I show you all sites. Garden of Gethsemane, Tomb of the Virgin, Church of Mary Magdalene. He might have been attractive if it weren't for his bad teeth and large mole on the right side of his face. Sharon leaned heavily on Carly's shoulder and whispered in her ear, "He looks like a terrorist." Carly ignored her older sister. 120. The guide straightened his spine. 200. He patted the dented fender of his Volkswagen Golf as if it were a fine camel. Carly agreed. She was a thin, wiry woman who wore her hair scraped to the crown of her head, anchored with a rubber band. She'd come on this trip to Israel after their mother, Mariah, had called to badger her. "Come on, babe, patch it up. Sharon's bad." "Is that what she told you?" Carly asked. The telephone crackled as Mariah exhaled a lungful of what Carly assumed was marijuana smoke. Not so many words. Carly had recently separated from her husband, and soon after the call, she began to dream about Sharon 2 or 3 times a night. She awoke with a feeling on her skin that Sharon had touched her. Inside the cab, Sharon closed the windows and asked the guide to turn up the air conditioning. She'd always hated the heat. To escape the odor of the driver's sweat and aftershave, Carly opened the window on her side. They dipped into the Kidron Valley, where the guide pointed out the burial place of Absalom, King David's rebellious son. The small car was soon panting up the mountain. As he drove, the guide introduced himself as Suleiman. Sharon brightened. "The Muslim variation of Solomon, David's good son." Suleiman told them he lived with his wife and 8 children not far away, on the south side of the Mount of Olives. Where groves once had flourished, the mountain was now tightly packed with houses, churches, and cemeteries. The approach to the Garden of Gethsemane was jammed with idling tour buses spewing exhaust. Suleiman coaxed the Golf, inch by inch, into a space the size of a coffee table. There were a dozen remaining olive trees in the garden, but only one twisted relic looked old enough to have dropped hard green fruit at Christ's feet. Sharon whipped her pocket edition of the New Testament from her purse and thumbed the pages of Mark. They came to a small estate called Gethsemane, and Jesus said to his disciples, "Stay with me while I pray." Religious claptrap. Carly put on her sunglasses as if the gesture in some small way would block her sister's voice. She hardly recognized this bulky woman in rubber-soled shoes and floppy sun hat. Carly's memories were of a skinny-legged 17-year-old with big tits who played 8-track tapes by the knack and danced on her bed to My Sharona. They'd shared a bedroom from the time they were toddlers, but their closeness ended the year Sharon was 17, Carly 13. Sharon stole $250 that Carly had earned babysitting on weekends, each dollar hoarded in a shoebox to buy a Nikon. The school yearbook needed a photographer, and the camera, Carly had hoped, would be her passport into this closely knit group of kids. The money, Sharon, and the yearbook slot all disappeared. Carly learned later from Mariah that her sisters spent the cash on meth. Sharon hitchhiked around the country, became addicted, and eventually entered rehab in Portland, where she married the minister who ran the halfway house. Carly had never met Hugh, but she savored the thought that he married Sharon as much for her cantaloupes as her conversion. The pair had been wed 25 years now and had 4 children. Although Mariah called Carly occasionally to update her, Carly refused to see or talk to Sharon or any of her family. Sharon closed the Bible. They squeezed back into the car and climbed to a contemporary church atop the mountain. At this spot, Suleiman said Jesus cried as he gazed across the valley at the temple in Jerusalem, foreseeing its destruction by the Romans. As the sisters slipped inside, Sharon opened to Luke. Carly escaped another reading from the Gospels by going to the church's arched front window, which framed a view of Jerusalem. She'd read that all buildings were required to be faced with Jerusalem stone, a whitish limestone used in the construction of the temple in Jesus' time. The stone gave the city a cohesive look, as though its structures sang a concordant song. The sun sank low, but she still felt the heat through the glass. As she watched, Jerusalem began to gleam with a trembling golden light. It touched first the tips of the steeples and minarets, then crept downward over the roofs and walls until the entire city shimmered. Carly, a director of television documentaries, knew that this was the moment of long light, the best possible time for filming. The phenomenon depended on the sun's angle, the thickness of the atmosphere, and the range of the color spectrum. She often gathered her crew in anticipation of this 20 or 30 minutes of low sun. Yet now she stumbled outside, swiping at her eyes with her knuckles. She was a practical woman, some said a hard woman, and she told herself it was the science, the physics of long light that moved her. Christ had felt it too, she thought, this feeling of loss and yearning, of the fragility of beauty, which lasted only until it was obliterated by the next invasion, fire, flood, earth mover, divorce, or layoff. When she and Sharon were young, they had their fill of beautiful places. Mariah was a nomadic ski instructor who dragged her daughters from Aspen to Stowe, from Alta to Tahoe to Vail. Each move robbed Carly of her familiar landmarks, the hill where she fell racing her inline skates, the little grotto in the park lined with lilacs where she kissed her first boyfriend. Her history had been stolen from her time after time. She smelled smoke and turned to see Suleiman. "You like this place, yes?" he asked. "Very pretty," she said. "You don't like?" She blinked, surprised that despite his bad English, he was perceptive. "It's just a place, Suleiman." He drew on his cigarette, and the tip gleamed. "My grandfather, he lives with us. Every day he watches sun come up, sun go down. He cries for his little farm on West Bank. Jews have built apartment house there." "He cries? He doesn't wish they were dead?" "Perhaps he does." He crushed the butt under his feet. Light faded quickly, and a sad gray haze settled over the city's stones. Loudspeakers in a nearby mosque snapped on, the call to prayer quivering in the evening air. The next morning's pre-dawn call to prayer jolted Carly awake. Their guest house in the Muslim quarter of the old city faced a mosque, and through the open window the muezzin's voice blared on the public address system. In the twin bed across the room, Sharon's limbs jerked. She moaned in her sleep. Carly gazed at her sleeping sister in the moss-green neon light. Since she'd last seen Sharon, her face had become furrowed with a landscape of hills and valleys. Her eyes retreated deep under her brows, surrounded by thin, discolored tissue. Under the sheet, her humped bulk resembled an undersea creature. She could have been a stranger, but here they were, sharing a room again. After the muezzin ended his chant, Carly's eyes refused to close. Sharon awoke near dawn. Her forehead wrinkled as though she were trying to remember who Carly was. Then she nodded and slipped her hand under her cheek in a gesture Carly remembered. "There's an island in the blue, blue Pacific." Sharon's voice was husky. "It's our island, and on this island there's a house," Carly answered unwillingly. Sharon had invented this game, and when they lived in a shabby ski-town apartment, as they lay in bed each night, they embellished the fantasy. A fabulous house where the two of them would stay forever. "I have a huge water bed in my room with black satin sheets," Sharon said. When Carly didn't answer, she raised her eyebrows. "That wasn't it," Carly said finally. It wasn't your bedroom. It was our bedroom. The two of us." "I don't remember that." She should have. Sharon pretty much raised Carly, buying the frozen turkeys and making Carly's dentist appointments. She beat up the kids who hazed Carly because she was new to school, boys who pinched her nipples and girls who stuffed bloody maxi pads in her locker. Every night, Sharon eased their loneliness by enticing Carly to play the island game, their opportunity to escape. But Sharon disappeared. Carly, in the nights afterward, huddled in bed under the blankets with her back to the twin, stripped to the bare mattress. Wind sowed in the pine branches outside her window. The frozen pellets of spring snow clattered against the glass. Bitter cold crept through the apartment's thin insulation. When the bars closed at 2, her mother arrived home, often accompanied by her boyfriend, Gary the ski bum. There was muffled laughter. Shoes dropped on the floor. Mariah's headboard beat against the common wall. Carly plugged her ears, but she couldn't shut out the thumps, the squeaks of the bed frame, filthy words, moans, and long, drawn-out cries. She grabbed handfuls of her hair and twisted them in her fist until her scalp throbbed. During the day, she cried over small incidents, a frayed shoelace that snapped in her hand, or spilled hot chocolate on her clean white notebook page. When a boy in her class, an overbearing bully she hated, died in an avalanche, Carly wept until she couldn't talk. The next winter, Carly and Mariah moved to Jackson Hole, where Carly enrolled in a high school film class. She began to write scripts, use the heavy camera, and edit tape. She didn't cry as often, but her face was tight and achy. The Sisters of Zion, the French order that operated the guest house, offered breakfast, but neither Carly nor Sharon was hungry. They sat silently at an umbrella table on the veranda. Carly sipped a cup of coffee while Sharon tapped a cell phone message to Oriana, the last of her children still at home. Acid in the coffee burned Carly's stomach. It was unfair that Sharon, a thief and a reformed druggie, had an attentive husband and 4 children, while Carly, who stayed through high school with their unstable mother, had to endure their marginal existence and work her way through the University of Colorado. Her soon-to-be ex-husband already had consulted a lawyer, and they had no child. Sharon leaned over to tie her shoe. "Let's go to the Wailing Wall before it gets too hot." Her breath was loud and uneven. Carly's mouth tightened into an uncharitable fist. Sharon should lose some weight. On the Via Dolorosa, they narrowly missed being knocked down by the crosspiece of a 7-foot wooden cross carried by pilgrims who crowded this street that Christ traveled to Calvary. Worshippers eddied around a priest who recited the second station of the cross. Pontius Pilate handing Jesus over to be crucified. Pressed against a stone wall, Carly studied the pilgrims' frozen faces. They looked not inspired or transported, but burdened by sorrow. People bore their hurts and disappointments until they were familiar as tight shoes, Carly thought. The old city was built on hills, and the streets descended and rose in a series of worn steps. Muslim boys in blue uniform shirts darted through the crowd on their way to class at the madrasa. At the bottom of Via Dolorosa, the street joined El Wad, the Muslim quarter's main pedestrian thoroughfare. 2 Israeli soldiers, boys with soft chin hairs, guarded the intersection, their automatic weapons propped diagonally across their chest. Tall buildings shaded the streets, but Carly's filmmaker's eye caught a shaft of early morning sun slipping between the buildings to cast a wedge of brilliant illumination high on a wall of Jerusalem stone. The souk stirred. Shopkeepers rolled up their metal stall doors to display olive wood carvings of the Virgin, cheap Russian Orthodox icons, cell phones, DVDs, and fake Roman oil lamps. The souk smelled of ancient sewers and washed paving stones. Aromas of allspice and cumin floated from an open-air food shop where a cook fried kibbeh in hot oil. The odors stimulated Carly's senses, so often constrained by calculations of light, frame, and camera angle. Her body felt buoyant. A boy passed, balancing a board on his head loaded with freshly baked loaves. She wasn't hungry earlier, but the yeasty smell lured her to buy a round loaf sprinkled with sesame seeds. When Sharon caught up, Carly broke off 2 pieces and offered her one. Sharon grimaced. I saw flies. There might be germs. It's too early for flies, and the bread's still warm. There's a smell. Suit yourself. Carly threaded quickly between the shoppers down El Wad to the Wailing Wall, leaving Sharon to struggle through the lava flow of old men, housewives, Orthodox Jews, chanting Christians, and aggressive Muslim vendors hawking rosary beads. It didn't feel as good as Carly imagined it would to reverse their childhood order where Sharon led the way. At the Wailing Wall Plaza, Sharon caught up, gasping. Hair at the nape of her neck was dark with sweat, and irregular red patches spotted her cheeks. Is this about the bread? She snatched at the plastic bread sack in Carly's hand. Here, give me a piece. Too late. Carly dumped it into her trash barrel. You're hard and spiteful. Sharon's heavy jowls tightened, a mother fed up with her exasperating child. Carly was diverted by a band of 30 or 40 people celebrating a bar mitzvah at the Wailing Wall. A boy about 12 bobbed in their midst. Rearing above them was the 70-foot remnant of the vanished temple's limestone retaining wall. She recognized the wall's white rock as Jerusalem stone. Sharon jostled her elbow. I bought tickets for the underground tour. They've excavated 5 times as much as you can see here. I'm not going, Carly said. Well, it's the closest we'll get to the spot where Jesus turned out the money changers. Carly's feet twitched, longing to get away from this tourist trap. Sharon seized her arm and steered her to a group clustered around the guide, an Orthodox Jewish woman who wore a long skirt and concealed her hair with a tightly wrapped scarf. Carly trailed sullenly at the end of the group, holding to the handrail as they clanged across catwalks and down metal stairs deep into the tunnel. Jackhammers spewed dust into the air and rattled the ground under their feet. The damp air was suffocating. The guide stopped at the base of one of the great towering blocks. A wall of Jerusalem stone loomed above them and stretched far ahead into the darkness. This is the largest of the blocks, 43 feet tall and weighing nearly 600 tons, she said. Carly laid her palm against the surface. It felt benign, but she knew that toes and fingers, legs and arms, lives had been sacrificed to bring it here. As the group shuffled deeper into the tunnel, a narrow alcove opened where a murmuring woman sat on a white plastic chair. Her face hovered so close to the wall she could kiss it. The guide gathered everyone around her and whispered in a voice as compelling as a prayer. In the time of the second temple, the area right above us was the most sacred place in the Jewish world, the Holy of Holies. It was the ancient site of Mount Moriah and the Garden of Eden, the place where Abraham bound Isaac. Sharon took a shaky breath. The woman at the wall began to weep. The cry quivered in the dusty air, contagious, almost irresistible. A cry was forming in Carly's throat when Sharon stumbled past her, nearly knocking her down. Sharon pressed her cheek to the stone. "Sorry I did it, Carly, but I was 17. You sucked me dry, and I didn't want to be your mother, nanny, or even your friend. I just wanted to be gone." The praying woman's cries rose in pitch. Dust stung Carly's eyes, and construction lights seemed to dim. Members of the tour filed past, eyeing them curiously. "There was nothing for me in Vail," Sharon said. "I wasn't going to graduate. We'd changed schools so many times. What was I going to do? Spend my life babysitting you? Or hanging on to that boy, Darren, who only called when he wanted to fuck?" Carly's voice was cold. "I was 13. We were going to stick together against everyone." "That was a kid's dream." "Right. And I was the kid who bankrolled your bus fare." The next morning, Suleiman bumped his small car down the Via Dolorosa steps to the guest house. For the trip to Bethlehem, he wore a new pair of shoes and an ironed shirt. When Sharon and Carly were settled inside, he backed the Golf up to an alcove wide enough to turn around. They followed the ring road outside the old city wall. "I show you first old way to go to Bethlehem," he said. The route wound through West Jerusalem, past modern buildings constructed of the same light stone. He stopped a short distance from a pedestrian crossing between Israel and the Palestinian Protectorate. Muslim women in scarves and black dresses moved slowly past armed soldiers. "Before, we drove straight to Bethlehem, right here, very close. Now cars must go 20-kilometer detour," he said. On the auto road, a concrete wall topped with chain-link fence and razor wire bordered the asphalt. Jews call security fence. We call apartheid wall. Suleiman's picked at the mole on his cheek. The only view from Carly's side of the car was gray concrete and glittering wire. The aura of suspicion and mistrust pressed like a great weight on her shoulders. Sharon looked out the window on her side at the dry, rocky hills. Palestinian soldiers waved Suleiman through the vehicle checkpoint after a few words in Arabic. He seemed different here. One hand relaxed on the wheel, an arm cocked on the windowsill. The car rolled into Bethlehem, where streets were dense with traffic and businesses advertised in Arabic script. He parked in a small courtyard outside a souvenir shop. Waiting was a cadaverous man with a wispy goatee. This was Samuel, their local guide to the Basilica of the Nativity. "You're not coming with us?" Carly prodded Suleiman to accompany them, although she thought that Muslims probably were discouraged from entering churches. "I was looking forward to your narration. Suleiman's eyes were hidden by his aviator sunglasses, but she saw a quiver of amusement around his mouth. Muslims recognized Jesus as one of 124,000 prophets. I am not so familiar with all of them. Samuel led the way. The guide business must not pay much, Sharon muttered. He looks as though he needs a good meal. When they arrived at the huge basilica, Samuel warned them to watch their heads as they entered. It was built with a low, narrow door to encourage humility. Inside, he whispered that the basilica was the oldest known Christian church, built by the Emperor Constantine about 330 A.D. Sooty candle smoke drifted up from dozens of votive lamps dangling from the high ceiling like bats. Disappointment flooded Carly. The church was tainted by human incursions. Gilded icons of obscure saints were blackened with smoke. The mosaic floors chipped. Odors of melted wax and burned wicks stung her nose. Samuel led them through the basilica and down narrow steps dimpled by millions of pilgrim shoes. Sharon had to stoop to ease herself through the doorway. The small, airless chapel was stifling with the body heat of 20 other visitors. A dozen silver lamps hung from the underside of an altar which shielded a star embedded in the floor. Samuel murmured, "Below, the opening in the center of the star is the spot where Mary gave birth to Jesus." Awkwardly, Sharon knelt at the altar and buried her face in her palms. Carly didn't kneel. She'd last visited a church when one of her film crew was married. The vows of her own now dissolving marriage were exchanged in a Reno wedding chapel. After a minute or two, Sharon struggled to stand. Her breath was shallow and uneven. "I need some air. I'll meet you outside." Her skin was papery white. "I'll come," Carly said. Sharon shook her head. Left behind, Carly wriggled past another pilgrim to skim the polished marble surface of the nativity altar with her fingers. It was too smooth and elaborate. Ragged stone or wind-gouged wood would have been more appropriate. Birth was about fear and pain. Carly flinched in the blinding sun when she stepped outside. Sharon sat with Samuel and Suleiman in the shade of an olive tree, fanning herself with the brim of her hat. I'm here at his birthplace, the very spot, and instead of praying, I nearly faint. The sweat on Sharon's face glistened like tears. Carly was alarmed at Sharon's condition. "We should go back to Jerusalem." "There is another place," Suleiman said. "Sharon can't make it." "What place?" Sharon said. "The milk grotto." Carly snorted. "What's that? A shop for Muslims who don't drink coffee?" He looked shocked. No, it is cave where Holy Family hid during slaughter of innocents. King murdered all boys under 2, hoping to kill one foretold to be ruler." "We can't miss it," Sharon said. She and Samuel walked slowly, hugging the shade cast by the stone walls. Carly and Suleiman forged ahead. "Muslims revered this site also," he said. "When Holy Mother Mary fed baby with her milk, drop falls on rock in cave. Miracle happen. And today crushed stone help women be fertile and produce much milk." At the mention of breast milk, he looked away. "Do you believe the story? My wife mixed some of the powder with goat's milk before our first was born." The grotto was carved of Jerusalem stone, producing a creamy interior light infused with golden flecks. How she'd like to capture this light on video. For a few moments, she analyzed what angle might be needed and wondered how long the phenomenon would last. But soon the voice of her thoughts thinned and disappeared. The odor of Suleiman's aftershave hung in the air, and beneath that the scent of powdery rock dust. The only other visitor was a praying monk in a white cassock with curling tufts of neglected beard on his cheeks. The tap, tap, tap of his clicking rosary beads echoed the beat of her heart. Carly tiptoed to the deepest part of the grotto and touched the wall. Powdery earth clung to her hand. Each particle burned and tingled. When she wiped her palm on her skirt, white streaks appeared on the dark fabric, and her hand began to swell. In a panic, she put her fingers in her mouth and sucked them like a child. The earthy taste coated her throat. Her senses expanded like a sail filled with a great clean wind. She could take in everything without effort. Human smells, taste of powdery earth, smooth talc caked in the whorls of her fingers, odd heat in her throat, click of beads, strange golden light. Her body hummed, and she felt dizzy. One more scent or sound, and she would faint. "Suleiman, do you feel it?" she whispered. He shook his head. She saw his mole and bad teeth and the priest's carelessly shaven face, but their flaws seemed like the indulgently observed faults of precious children. She wanted urgently to see Sharon. The sun outside burned directly overhead, and the reflection off the grotto's blinding facade stabbed her pupils. Sharon sat in a thin crescent of shade, rubbing her swollen ankles. Her wide-brimmed hat rested beside her on the bench. She tipped her head to look up at Carly. The reflected light from the Jerusalem stone was particularly clear. For a second, Sharon's puffy skin seemed to slide away. The years receded, and she was young again, even less like the fierce, protective sister Carly remembered. Instead, Sharon was the scared, desperate girl who had run away all those years ago to save her own life. The light shifted, and Carly realized her mother was right. Sharon was very ill. Her skin was putty-colored. Lines radiated from her lips like an old woman. Brushing aside the hat, Carly sat down beside her sister. Sharon looked at Carly's stricken face and nodded. "It's bad. Soon to get much worse." "When?" "6 months. Maybe a little more." "Your timing sucks." "Oh, yes," Sharon said. Carly thought about Christ's tears and Suleiman's mole and her own anger, which she'd nursed like a child at her breast for over 25 years. "Back then," Sharon said, "I fantasized you were dead." "Same here." Carly massaged her temples where her hair was pulled back too tightly. Sharon shook herself. "You were a stone around my neck. I wanted to be free." Carly set the hat on Sharon's head and tilted the brim to shield her eyes and carefully anchored the slide in the little hollow under her chin. "This time, I'm hiding my nickels and dimes." "Forget it. I've saved up." Sharon propped her legs in front of her and stretched her dusty toes inside her sandals. Samuel and Suleiman's voices drifted over the wall. As Sharon and Carly sat together in the narrowing strip of shade, Carly caught the scent of her sister's illness like bruised fruit. She stayed close and breathed it in.